All right, so we're going to talk about the superpower of crowd forecasting. So when you think about it, why do we even need forecasting? Okay, there's a great Frenchman, also called Emile by accident or by coincidence, who was the inventor of the modern magazine, the modern press, in the 19th century. Actually, the guy who invented the idea of putting advertising on the newspaper to finance the newspaper so you could lower the price and have greater distribution. And he was also a politician, and his great motto that survived the ages is governing is all about predicting. You cannot govern properly unless you can predict properly. And it's probably the first time you ever heard a politician talk about probabilities in the same sentence, governing and probabilities, right? So anyone not read French here? Raise your hand. Okay, so I'm going to translate it. It's actually written in English below, but it's probably too small. He says, probability estimation applied to the life of nations is the foundation of all high politics. Whether the estimations of probability are rigorous or faulty, thorough or neglected, politics is glorious or disastrous. Okay? Great or small, governing is predicting. Gouverner, c'est prévoir. Okay? Unless you can predict properly, you cannot govern properly. Good for us, it turns out that forecasting can be greatly helped by crowdsourcing. Okay? So if you think about it, what is forecasting? Forecasting is two things. First of all, gathering information so that you can actually make an educated guess, and then actually making that educated guess, because there's always a part of uncertainty that remains no matter how much information you try to gather, right? So it turns out that the first part, information gathering, is greatly helped by crowdsourcing, as we know from Wikipedia, for example, right? The one individual cannot gather so much information. There's too many cognitive constraints, availability constraints, etc. If you crowdsource information gathering to the crowd, you can go much deeper and much wider at the same time, just like Wikipedia just blew out of the water all the encyclopedias in the world, right? But estimation, guessing, is also greatly helped by crowdsourcing. Why? We saw a slide earlier. Everybody makes biased, erroneous estimations because of their limited availability, because of all the noise that your subjectivity creates or your lack of information. Everybody has different lacks of information. But when you combine the guesses of everyone, for example, by just simple averaging, you accumulate the knowledge that everyone brings to the table, and you cancel each other's mistakes, because mistakes tends to be symmetrical, right? And the more of us there are, the more likely it is that there is somebody here who's going to make a mistake that is exactly symmetrical to the mistake I would make, and therefore the average of the two of us would be the perfect estimation, right? So that's how the crowd can vastly improve forecasting, okay? So here's an example. Here's a question that we asked. Now you can see on the dates here from the end of 2002, so it's been almost a year, probably a year now, on whether Putin is going to survive this Ukraine war and stay president until 2023, at the end of 2023. So we do this through what we call the prediction market. Prediction market is essentially a online betting platform, right? But instead of betting on the football game tonight, you're betting on something actually happening in the world that might be of importance, right? So we try to focus on important things with this betting platform. And of course, it's not a real betting platform, because that would be completely illegal, except in England, which is not part of Europe, I hear. We do this through some kind of game where people participate freely and then they can win prizes when they make correct bets. Okay, so then we can bet on anything that we want and gather the collective intelligence of the crowd on those bets. And the way it happens is that you ask a question, could be a yes or no question, as in this case, and then people can buy or sell that prediction on a market. Okay, and the correct prediction, the yes or the no, is going to be worth 100 points or 100 whatever. And the no prediction, the losing prediction, is going to be worth 0. In the meantime, you can see how the price of the prediction evolves between 0 and 100, depending on the demand and supply, and the negotiation between the participants who believe something is going to happen or not happen. Okay? So in fact, that price of the prediction on the market between 0 and 100 can be considered to be the probability that something will happen. Okay? Here's an example of how that works. So if you take the yes, you have, it's like a market, really. So you have somebody who comes in and says, maybe, this person says, I want to buy at 86. And then, somebody else comes and says, no, I don't want to buy at 86. I want to sell it to you at 92. Okay, so they don't agree on the price. So then they need to negotiate. Maybe somebody else comes in and says, I want to buy at 90. And then eventually somebody says, okay, I like your price. I'm going to sell it to you at 90. And then there's a trade, and the price of the prediction becomes 90 out of 100, which means there's 90% probability, according to the collective intelligence of the market, that this event will happen. Okay? So using that logic, you can apply this prediction market approach to any type of event that you like, as long as you can observe the result in the future, right? So you could ask questions about climate. Okay, what will be the average temperature of the world this year? Is it going to be worse than the previous record in 2020? Okay, or is it going to be not as bad as the previous year? And then you can see how that evolves. As more information comes in, people can revise, the market can revise its estimation, and you can see how it evolves. Right? Or you could say, which of these two antagonistic leaders, Zelensky or Putin, is going to be out of power first, for whatever reason. And you can see currently, for example, the market estimates that Putin is more likely to lose power than Zelensky, before Zelensky. Okay, and it's about 60 to 40. Or you could say, important economic thing, is the new World Fair going to come to Europe, or is it going to be going to Saudi Arabia or to Asia? Okay. And people can give you their estimation. Or you could say, what's the probability that Marine Le Pen is going to win power in France in a few years, right? Which would be a big problem for Europe. And so people can give you their probabilities of what will happen in the next election. Okay. So it's very easy to get the crowd to give you probabilities, and then the question is, how reliable, how accurate are these probabilities? And here we have a lot of data, because we've been doing this for a very long time. So this is data from 8.5 years past, starting in June 2014 until December 2022, on 816 questions of politics, macroeconomics, geopolitics. Principally, we may have done a couple World Cup bets along the way, but very few. So 2,535 possible answers, possible predictions, almost 1 million trades. And what you can see here is the adequation, the correspondence between the prediction and the reality. Okay, so how does that work? We take all the predictions that have been traded on the market at, let's say, 20%. And then we look at how many of those predictions actually did happen. And we find that about 20% of them did happen. And you can do this at every level of probability. So if you take, for example, all the predictions that have been made at 40%, you find that about 40% of them actually did occur in the world. Okay? All the predictions made at 80%, and you find that almost 80% of them did occur in the real world. So there's almost a perfect correspondence here. You can see the linear regression. Reality is the prediction minus 1%. Essentially, so it's actually almost perfect, which is amazing. What does it mean? How could it almost looks like magic? What it means is that people are not able to tell you exactly that this will absolutely certainly happen and this won't certainly happen. What they are able to give you is an almost perfect probability that something might happen or not. Okay? Which means that if you say something is 90% likely to happen, if the probability is correct, one time out of 10% of the time, it will not happen, even though you gave it 90% probability. Okay? So sometimes it's hard to get your head around probabilities, because when somebody says 90%, you interpret it as for sure. It's not for sure. One time out of 10, the one who gave you the probability is going to look stupid, because that's the curse of the accurate probabilistic forecaster. But it's almost magic. People are able to, the crowd is able to discern very precisely the probability field that underlies reality. Okay. So we talked about how you can use prediction markets to gather the collective intelligence of the crowd. There's also another way you can do this that's generally easier for people to participate in, which we call prediction polls. So in prediction polls, instead of trading in a market, which some people find complicated, we ask everyone to give their probabilities directly, and then we use algorithms to put it together into a collective forecast. And the algorithm can be ultra simple, like just take the average of everybody's probability. Or it could be more complicated by considering the track record of each individual and giving more weight to some predictions, giving more weight to the experts in the crowd rather than the others, things like that. Right? So we had the chance to try this relatively recently, just before the pandemic and during the pandemic, with the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health in Baltimore, which some of the biggest experts on epidemiology and public health. And they had these huge dashboards during the pandemic on COVID-19, which you may have seen. And just before the pandemic, actually a year before, we had started this great program with them on inviting experts around the world to try to forecast the severity of various epidemics of infectious disease around the world. So for 15 months, we had hundreds of people answer 61 questions about severity of various viruses, 19 different viruses. You can see Ebola, influenza, dengue, etc. around the world. And we asked them questions of the type that you see here. For example, how many countries, how many states in the World Health Organization would have at least 1,000 cases of COVID before April 2nd? Okay, so very precise questions to try to track the severity of the disease and the spread of the disease and the outbreak. And people could give probabilities for various answers. You can see like less than 15 states. So it's not going to be a very severe outbreak. Or it could be all the way to more than 46 states, in which case it would be qualified as a severe outbreak. And people would participate. You see, we invited like 562 people recruited primarily by Johns Hopkins University, and then also some skilled, experienced forecasters from Hypermind who were generally betting on geopolitics and decided that they were interested in also voluntarily forecasting on epidemics as well. And we could compare then the 70% experts type with the skilled forecasting type as well.
Thank you very much. And my question would be, when you were saying that people were recruited, I was saying on basis of what? If you could explain and develop a bit further the criteria upon where you pick these people to put in the poll. Thank you.
Sure. So there are two types of people. People recruited from Hypermind, who are basically vetted forecasters who we know from their track record are generally pretty good at forecasting just about any question that they are interested in. Okay? They could be anyone. The number one guy in Hypermind today is a radiologist in Alsace. The number two guy is a lawyer in Connecticut. Whatever, citizens, basically, interested citizens, informed, interested in the world and what's going on, generally pretty well informed, very curious, very open-minded, all kinds of very specific psychological profile that is characterized by open-mindedness and the inverse of wishful thinking, if you like, right there. Yes.
That's how do you then find out about, for example, like their type of personality? Like, how do you find out that they're open-minded? Like, do you?
We had this great program during 2012 to 2016 with the U.S. government, the intelligence agencies, where we had 10,000 people. We did this with the University of Pennsylvania and the what's called the Intelligence Advanced Research Project Agency in the US, which is the DARPA of intelligence agencies, right? So they had this great program on crowd forecasting for many years, in which 10,000 people recruited from the readers of the New York Times and Wall Street Journal and whatever, right, were invited to forecast geopolitical events around the world. And we could assess very precisely who's good, who's not good. We found that some people are really good, and then the next year they are the same people who are really good, so they are really champions of forecasting. And nowadays they are commonly referred to as super forecasters, right? And because we are doing this with the Department of Psychology at Pennsylvania, at University of Pennsylvania, we could assess, they went through batteries of tests, psychological tests, and we could find out that these people were smart, but not smarter than you guys. Okay? And there's about 2% of them who are just really good at forecasting. And those 2%, what they have in common is, for example, that they are very open-minded. What that means is not that they open their chakras and everything's cool, right? What it means is that they are actively open-minded. So when they think about a problem, they actively seek people who are going to think differently from them. They look for contradictions. They are not afraid of finding people who tell them that they are completely wrong in their thinking about the problem. On the contrary, the more people they find who give them contradictory opinions, and the happier they are, because they think they learn something every time. It doesn't mean they accept the other opinion, but at least they have considered it, right? So they are open to the diversity of input around them. That's their primary characteristic, okay? Which is very difficult to do. Most of us don't like that. We like information bubbles where everybody thinks the same as us. So it's like learning to ride a bicycle at the beginning, to be open to the ideas of others. It's complicated, but then you can eventually learn from it. Yes. Just to get back to you, so how was the recruiting performed? First, people from Hypermind, experienced forecasters, super forecasters, you might call them. Secondly, Johns Hopkins advertised the prediction contest in many professional newsletters, so that they could reach, like the epidemiology journal or epidemiology international newsletter online, and they would advertise until those people would then voluntarily recruit themselves into the contest of prediction, and we would know that these people are experts in different aspects of medicine. Maybe they are expert veterinarians, expert epidemiologists, experts public health, working in government, etc. So that's how the recruiting was done. Now, this is how people would participate. So we had this website built by Hypermind where we would ask the question, and then people could adjust their probabilities to assess the severity of the outbreak. They could see the evolution of the crowd forecast, and they could try to beat the crowd forecast in order to win the competition. And then they could also discuss among themselves in the forums. Okay. Very simple. And these are the results. So here we're looking at the performance, the global average error of 562 forecasters individually. Okay, so you take you've answered maybe out of 61 questions, you answered maybe 20. We look at your average error on these 20, and then we plot you're one of these data points here. Maybe you're this one here. Okay? So what you see here is that, so the people at the bottom are the people who are making the fewest mistakes. People at the top are making the biggest mistakes. Okay? What you see is that people tend to cluster around the orange line, right? What is this level of error? Turns out it's the level of chance. Chance forecasting. What does it mean, chance forecasting? It means basically you're like a monkey throwing darts to select your answer. Okay? You're not very good. But these people were not monkeys. Okay? These people were, for 70% of them, public health professionals informing policymakers, right? Experts, right? So why was it so hard? It was so hard because forecasting is hard and it's hard work. It takes a lot of work to actually come up with a forecast. You need to gather the information. You need to think it through. You need to discuss it with other people. You need to work in order not to be making a stupid forecast. And secondly, why is it so hard? Is because in most of these questions, for example, you remember the beginning of COVID, nobody knew what the COVID was, right? Nobody knew how it was transmitted. People thought it was transmitted by spit, right? And then we found out 6 months later it's transmitted actually through the air, right? So you might have a white blouse and you might be a public health expert or a super doctor. You have never seen COVID before. There's no data on COVID that's available. The data that's available is noisy or it's completely bad. So there's basically no experts on COVID, right? So most of these questions that we ask about, even an Ebola outbreak in Congo, by the time that you get the numbers for how many cases there actually are, if you do have a clear idea of how many cases there are on the ground in Congo, by the time it gets to your lab in Washington, D.C., or your think tank or whatever, the data is already outdated, right? So the data is noisy, the data is bad, the data is sparse, and that's what characterizes these difficult forecasting problems. It's not a problem where you can ask, ChatGPT to give you an answer, right? And in fact, you could say crowd forecasting starts where all the AIs of the world today basically become clueless, making predictions with almost no data in databases somewhere. Okay? You cannot train a learning system to do predictions on very sparse data. But the magic of crowd forecasting is such that when you just take the simple, stupid average of everybody's forecast, and you look at that crowd forecast error, it's better than 99% of all the individuals who participated. As you can see here, only 6 individuals did better than the crowd average. Okay? And if you take something less stupid than just the sheer average by looking at the track record of people as they go along, so maybe this guy answered the first 5 questions really well, so then you give him more weight into the average as you go along, or maybe you can see that this woman here has been updating her forecast every day compared to this one who's been updating every week. So you say, okay, this person is following the problem much more closely, so I'm going to give her more weight in the average, right? So if you take these things in consideration, then you get the optimized crowd forecast that essentially beats everybody. All right? That's the power of crowd forecasting. So then we could compare also the public health experts with the general purpose skilled forecasters. People who don't know who are not experts or officially experts in public health or epidemiology, but who are sufficiently interested and have a track record as expert forecasters in politics, for example. And what you see here are different populations. And again, this is the error, right? So the lower is better. So you can see people who have the domain expertise, the experts in public health, the people who are expert forecasters, and the people who are neither expert forecasters or experts in the domain. Okay, and what you can see is that the overall, individually, the median forecasters in all these populations is about the same at the level of chance, like the monkey. Okay, so there's not much difference there. But if you look at the crowd average, the optimized crowd average for every one of these populations, you can see a strong wisdom of crowds effect, whereas the crowd for this population is much better, for this population is much better, etc. Okay. Other thing you see is that there's no difference between the crowd forecast of the experts and the crowd forecast of the super forecasters. The experts do not have an advantage over the generalized skilled forecasters. Okay. Another thing you see is that expertise does count, because if you have expertise either in forecasting or in the domain, your crowd is going to do better than the crowd that has neither type of expertise. Okay? And final thing, or not final thing, but you can see that when you mix the crowds that have these two types of expertise, then you do better than if you take the experts alone in the domain. Right? So there's a big value add to including citizen forecasters, you might call them, who are interested, who have some kind of knowledge or at least interest, curiosity, and a track record of excellent forecasting, include them along with the domain experts, and then you get a more powerful crowd by doing that. Okay? And final thing is that you can also invite those guys and include them into, by considering everybody, and you do not have worse performance of that crowd with everybody than you have by just including those with expertise. And the reason is that the algorithms learn as they go along, so that people who have no value are basically down-weighted by the algorithm, and people who do have value, because they're making good forecasts, are up-weighted by the algorithms. And so basically, the erroneous guys who don't know what they're talking about are dropped by the algorithm very quickly. Okay? And the others one are surfaced. So the takeaway here is domain experts, fine, but usually in a complicated problem, there's no experts. Or domain expertise can help you find out where to go for information, but it doesn't necessarily help you make great forecasts. And experts are generally very good at not making forecasts as well, because they are afraid of being wrong, especially publicly, right? Whereas citizens don't care so much for their reputation. And secondly, you can invite crowds of skilled citizen forecasters into the panel of expertise, because they have knowledge from the ground, and they have other kinds of information you might want to consider that goes looks at a different angle from those of the experts, and they can have a lot of value added, especially if they are vetted super forecasters that you've identified by previous prediction contests. Now, here's an example from Europe. Recently, so we have a client whose identity shall remain secret, who was really interested at a year ago when sanctions began against Russia, as to whether these sanctions would have an effect, what kind of effect, on what part of the Russian life it would have an effect, and when it might have an effect, right? So, where, when, and how much effect can we expect from these Western sanctions against Russia? And that was the extent of the client brief, like, give me predictions about that. Okay. All right, so what we did is we crowdsourced the different angles we could take on that question. So we went to the crowd and say, okay, crowd, what are your ideas on how we could measure, where we could expect the sanctions to have some kind of impact? What are the types of questions we should ask, etc. So they came up with like 120 different questions we could ask about the sanctions on Russia, and the clients selected 30 of those questions to put into a prediction contest. And then we asked the people to predict, for example, whether Putin will stay in power until the end of the year, just like we did with the epidemiology contest. Okay? And so they give us their overall average prediction, but we also ask them to justify their prediction. Every time they put in a probability, say, okay, why did you put this probability? What was your reasoning? Okay, so people give us their reasons, and then we can essentially gather and curate those reasons that to accompany the forecasting, and then we can synthesize it either by hand or using AI technology nowadays, large language models to synthesize the different rationales that were given by the crowd. So not only do you have the quantitative probability prediction, but you also have the story that goes with the prediction, that justifies the prediction. Okay, so you have the story of what are the arguments of those who say Putin will stay in power, what are the arguments of those who say that he has a chance to be gone before the end of the year, right? So the policymaker has quantitative forecast and the backstory, explainable prediction, which is not something you can get from AI today. You don't get explainable prediction from AI today, if you ever get prediction at all, right? So to finish, takeaways, governing is, at the beginning at least, about proper prediction. Okay? If you cannot make a proper prediction, you cannot estimate the impact of your governing, then you shouldn't govern at all, because you're bound to make mistakes. The great thing is collective intelligence can help improve forecasting. As we can see, we can push the limit of individual expert forecasting pretty far, right? Secondly, the crowd forecasting is especially useful when you're dealing with a noisy subject, where expertise is very relative and where data is very sparse or doesn't exist at all, right? Which is most of what people have to deal with, right? We don't make predictions about stuff that AI makes predictions today, right? We don't have huge amounts of data on, let's say, European elections. How many European elections have there been? Maybe 20, I don't know, maybe 12, since they existed in their current form. So you don't educate an AI with 20 data points. That just doesn't exist, right? So, whether Putin is going to stay in power, whether a virus is going to do an outbreak, there is no data on that is in sufficient quantity that you can educate AIs with them or do statistics on them properly. So you have to rely on collective intelligence and crowd forecasting to do that properly. Also, as we could see, skilled forecastings from citizens on the ground can have an enormous value added instead of relying only on experts. And finally, the kind of prediction that you get is not only accurate probabilistically and quantitative, so you can say, not only like, yes, I think this will happen, that doesn't mean anything. Okay? If you say this will happen with 75% probability, that means something. Okay? Then you can calculate your risk. And it's explainable. You can get the number and you can get the story behind the number. Okay. So these are the takeaways. Okay.